In our next session on the S4 main stage, S4 Program Chair Dale Peterson will interview Justine Bone, CEO of MedSec.
Hello again.
Good morning.
Why don't you just take the
Thank
front
you.
chair? Thank you. So good morning, Justine, and welcome to S4.
Thank you very much for having me.
I want to just set the stage for this a little bit if I could. We don't usually talk about vulnerability disclosure at S4. We haven't, at least for over 5 years, because whoever finds the vulnerability gets to decide what to do with it. So arguing what the right thing is doesn't usually make a lot of sense. But we had a very unique situation in the ICS world with Justine's company, MedSec, doing some research on medical devices, finding some vulnerabilities, and then making vulnerabilities in some St. Jude medical devices, making those vulnerabilities known in conjunction with a financial trading company, Muddy Waters. And what made this a little bit unique was the vulnerabilities were announced, and Muddy Waters, made them public along with MedSec, and then also announced that they would be shorting the stock and that there was some financial relationship with MedSec to profit on their short selling. So we have I think we certainly haven't seen this before, and I know so it's a unique case and it's a controversial case. So Justine was kind enough to come up here and answer some questions on it. There were, and probably still are, a number of legal cases going on, so we did provide Justine a list of the questions we were going to start with, and they were all fine. They didn't say don't ask that, but I just wanted to, full disclosure, let you know we have at least let her know some of the questions. But they're the ones that I think you in the audience would want to ask as well. So I guess maybe we should start out by, if you could describe a little bit what the vulnerabilities you found.
Sure. Thank you for the introduction and the background on this project. I do have a couple of points to make just with regards to that. We did license our research to Muddy Waters, and we worked with them to, in fact, limit the extent of disclosure that was included within their initial report. I had a lot of conversations with a lot of folk about what it means to describe a vulnerability versus describing an attack scenario. And of course, the difference between a vulnerability and an exploit and an attack, and these are not people like us who have been in this industry for a long time. So we did not, in fact, release detailed vulnerability information as a part of that report. More information has come out more recently in response to the lawsuit, for example, but the details were withheld for obvious reasons. We did not want to publish a playbook, if you will. So anyway, back to the findings of our research. This MedSec spent 18 months looking at all of the major players in the cardiac space, and St. Jude Medical really stood out as far less secure than the others that we had looked at. The vulnerabilities probably don't surprise a lot of folk here because there's a lot of experience in this room with regards to critical systems, and they stem down to basic fundamentals related to encryption or the lack thereof, authentication or the lack thereof, input validation or the lack thereof. I mean, that's really the three buckets. And of course, we saw it in the case of St. Jude, those problems across the board. Our area of focus, we should remember, was really on the RF proprietary protocols used between the devices within the St. Jude medical ecosystem. And so fast forward to what I'm sure we're going to talk about this morning with regards to recent FDA and DHS announcements. There are vulnerabilities across the whole space, but our focus was on those RF protocols that enabled device-to-device communication.
And I guess we should note that there was some dispute early on with St. Jude and your company as to whether the vulnerabilities that you claimed were in there were actually in the products, and
yes,
some technical review. And for those of you that are not aware, the FDA on Monday came out with some news that, yes, in fact, there were vulnerabilities in these devices, and ICS CERT actually issued, I'm not sure if it was an alert or an advisory, but ICS CERT also said, yes, these devices have these types of problems.
Yes, ICS issued the first of what I anticipate to be several advisories. The FDA issued a more extensive bulletin outlining the big picture, and St. Jude themselves have acknowledged at least some of these issues and have issued one mitigation for one vulnerability addressing part of the problem. There are numerous other vulnerabilities that remain, for example, within the implants themselves that have not yet been addressed. But going back to your earlier question, yes, there was some doubt out there. We were not surprised that St. Jude themselves didn't immediately acknowledge these vulnerabilities because, frankly, they have a track history of doing that. Hence, as soon as Muddy Waters released their report, MedSec engaged with both the FDA and the DHS on a full disclosure basis to start working with those organisations to reproduce the research, to understand the vulnerabilities, so that they could help us compel St. Jude Medical to take responsibility and to, of course, address these issues.
And I think early, at the beginning when we were talking, you said St. Jude was lagging far behind, or I think I read that in the report as well. So you had a project to look at a lot of medical devices.
Right.
And I guess I'm a little bit surprised because I would have expected them all to have really substantial problems.
We all know that everything's got a problem eventually. With enough poking and prodding, things fall over, and some of these legacy systems, of course, are more vulnerable than contemporary systems. And let's look at the big picture here of lack of authentication, lack of encryption, lack of input validation. Well, you might see a subset of that across the board, but in the case of St. Jude Medical, there were problems throughout the entire ecosystem addressing all of those types of vulnerabilities. So, there were problems related to encryption, data at rest and in transmission, problems related to lack of authentication, hardware problems, for example, the use of a wand or not, when it comes to initiating data communications, hardware problems when it comes to the hardware hacking itself. So it was incredibly easy for our researchers to identify the I/O ports on these boards and connect and, analyze the firmware, get root immediately. There were really no barriers to our researchers at any point in time. It was almost like there was an invitation when you open this thing up to pull it apart. So.
Are you talking about most of the products or just the St. Jude
in
product?
the case of St. Jude. So with the other manufacturers, there were limitations of different types in different areas. There was the use of encryption, for example, really putting our researchers at the point where we could spend 12 months looking at this thing and maybe we'll get somewhere, but at this point, that's probably a pretty good job. There's the use of wand, for example, required for close proximity when you're initiating a therapy session. So, okay, well, at least somebody has to be there to kick off the session.
Right.
So there was tamper-proofing on the hardware. There was the removal of various I/O ports. So it was difficult for our engineers to have. So different mechanisms in different places. But in the case of St. Jude Medical, it was just almost like an invitation to come on in and analyze these things.
We actually ran a tri-sider where people could vote up questions, and one of the questions that got a few votes was, and I think this is what a lot of the people are wondering, is what should a provider or patient make of the information published by Muddy Waters and MedSec in the headlines? Be afraid and have a nice day. So essentially, this has been published. What should a hospital, what should a patient who has this, what should they be doing at this point?
Well, I think that they should help us hold the manufacturers accountable for these problems. I mean, we had two primary goals entering into this project. One was to compel St. Jude Medical to take responsibility for these issues and address them. The other was to allow patients to become aware of the risks that they're exposed to when they use this technology upon which, sometimes, in some cases, their life is dependent.
Yes.
We believe patients have a right to know about their risks. And, if we hadn't taken this course of action, I believe that to this day, they still would be in the dark and these implants would still be being deployed in a drastically insecure and unsafe way. So I think that, patients now have a right to know. They have insight now into the risks associated with these devices, and they can consult with their doctors accordingly. They can consider mitigations such as the use of the at-home monitoring device. This is a complicated scenario now because after the publication of our research, St. Jude then issued a recall of a lot of implants related to a hardware problem, a battery problem inside of them. So now a patient needs to weigh up the risks of disconnecting their at-home system due to cybersecurity vulnerabilities versus keeping that device online in order to monitor the state of their implants. So, yay, we're seeing St. Jude respond. They have now issued a patch, I believe. We have not seen it yet for these at-home systems. So, the things wheels are starting to turn in terms of addressing the problems. Okay. But needless to say, fixing the problems in the at-home monitoring unit, of course, doesn't fix the problems in the implants themselves. Fixing those problems will require a firmware update to those implants or an update of the implant itself. Now, look, I mean, the average person is not going to be targeted by an assassin focusing on these vulnerabilities. Right. So we've not seen any evidence of these threat scenarios actually playing out. Nonetheless, I think we should expect that the manufacturer does recognize the vulnerability and do what's appropriate in order to patch the fundamental problems.
Well, and I would assume there are competitive products, right? So
this
would be part of a patient or a doctor's risk decision.
Right.
Okay, well that's certainly information they could consider.
If we can bring some transparency to how these devices work, in part as an outcome of this project, then I think that's a good thing because, again, more information for the patient, the better.
Okay. Of course, there's going to be some harder questions, like the one that probably a lot of people are wondering is, through the years in vulnerability disclosure, there's been a lot of ways of doing this, right? You submit it directly to the vendor. You submit it to a search. You just put out an ode day or you put out your notice like you did. But you went this unique route, at least to date, of actually engaging or licensing the information to this financial trader. Why did you forego those other routes and go this route? I mean, what didn't you think those other routes would accomplish, and what were you trying to accomplish with this route?
Well, initially, when we conducted our research, our intention was to follow a more traditional route and to approach the manufacturer upon these findings. In the case of St. Jude, this is a very unusual situation where we know that other researchers have approached that company in the past, and we felt very confident based on that track history that St. Jude would not acknowledge the vulnerabilities and would not do anything about it. So we needed to look for another route to hold St. Jude accountable and to bring these issues to light because we feel patients have a right to know about these problems. So that's why we partnered with Muddy Waters. They have a track history of holding large public companies accountable for other types of fraudulent behavior. And so we took that direction. It's not something that is for the faint of heart, pardon the pun. Mm-hmm. It's not our business model. Yeah. We actually have a very traditional business model, and we're engaging with manufacturers, and we're doing a lot of security architecture work, and we're working with manufacturers to mitigate vulnerabilities as we find them. But this was an unusual situation with a company that we felt very confident was not going to do anything about the information, and in fact may do what they could to hush us up. And indeed, they did initiate a lawsuit against us, accusing us of conspiring to lie and lying about the existence of these vulnerabilities.
But I think the extra step now is and again, I don't like to take money out of anyone's pocket, but the ethics involved of actually making money based on disclosing a vulnerability that could affect a lot of people.
Well, first of all, recall that we didn't publicly disclose the details around these vulnerabilities. Right. Second of all, bug bounties do exactly that. Yes. Bug bounties reward researchers for the hard work that they've put into their research.
Well, and there's an exploit market, too, where you can sell these things.
That also exists as well. That also exists as well. So I don't think it's unusual for researchers to be compensated for their work. It is unusual for a manufacturer to not act responsibly once it receives vulnerability information. So, we like to think about the ethics in this particular approach to vulnerability disclosure, but, I would say, well, what about the ethics of receiving this information, denying it, and doing nothing about it? Continuing to profit while you knowingly implant insecure, malfunctioning devices inside of your customers. I mean, and profiting from that. That's where I would focus the ethical lens.
And I think that's fair, but that's a more general issue in the wide range of ways to disclose things. Vendor responses, especially the first time they get them, and they're not used to getting these things, and it's a whole change in their culture.
In this case, they are used to it. They've received information. I don't know if it's the same information. I'm going to make an assumption that my friend Barnaby Jack, who's sadly no longer with us, probably came across some very similar findings to what we did 3 years later.
So, but do you see this as, well, let me ask this two ways. Do you see this as something that should be happening more, where this is the way to make things work, is researchers can spend their time, which obviously has value to it, finding these things and then profiting in these ways? Is this
or is it recovering costs?
Or recovering costs. I mean, I fully acknowledge that, because we do some of this work more in past years than we do now, but there's a lot of pro bono type work if you let people loose on something without a contract to do things. So recovering costs is fine, but this is actually, I guess if you were going into it saying this is a strategy we have to pay for our research.
Look, I think now we have an example that manufacturers can look at and know is possible for researchers. It's not something that I would encourage. I think it's a very unusual alternative for a certain situation, such as what we just went through. Right. Typically, however, I think we're seeing technology vendors and manufacturers acting increasingly responsibly when receiving vulnerability information, and I don't think that these measures will be called for terribly often. It is, however, an option. This model can be pursued, and so maybe this will help, again, hold folks accountable for the vulnerabilities in their technology, so that it's a very unusual and rare occurrence when a relationship such as the one between MedSec and Muddy Waters occurs.
So it sounds like this is something that, after going through this experience, you would do again in certain circumstances.
I have no intention of doing this again, and we're not aware of any manufacturers that would require this kind of an approach. It's not MedSec's business model, but it's certainly a case study, if you will, that I'm sure folks will remember for a very long time, and is theoretically out there for someone else to pursue if it made sense. But it's not something to be dabbled in. We've been working extensively not only with the FDA and the DHS, but with a slew of law firms for the past 4.5 months. In response to the lawsuit, I will add, we did not lawyer up before we embarked on this project. We had to defend ourselves once we were sued, but it's a complicated, risky undertaking that I believe was worthwhile, because now we are seeing St. Jude Medical taking responsibility for the vulnerabilities and starting to address them.
Well, and that was at least one of the end goals, right? If not the primary.
Absolutely right.
Goal. Okay. So, and let's maybe go back, because I want to take advantage of your experience now in the medical device security and talk a little bit about that. You went into this project with, as you said, a number of different vendor solutions. What was the intention in bringing all these products in and letting some of your team loose on them to analyze the security? What was kind of the goal of the project at the start?
Well, we believe we've got a long way to go when it comes to medical device security. We believe that to be true, and we were lucky enough to have folks such as Dr. Himal Nayak on our board, who could give us insight into medical devices that previously has been a pretty opaque space for security researchers. I mean, we had to go in working with him in his role. He's a cardiac specialist with the University of Chicago School of Medicine. So he was able to help us understand the impact of these vulnerabilities as we discovered them and really frame our findings within a doctor's context. And so, you know, I think we've been fortunate to have folks like him working closely with us. Obviously, when it comes to even larger equipment, it's tricky for the average researcher to even get your hands on that equipment. So we're also partnering with healthcare providers, a couple of large hospital systems, so that we can help those guys tackle their extensive problems related to, for example, PHI and the protection of that, upon which you know, those systems are incorporating medical devices, and these are big black boxes for a lot of these people. And so we're helping the hospitals understand what their risks are, and then taking that information back to the manufacturer to address issues as we identify them.
But I guess and that's really good. I'm just wondering, what was the purpose? Like, you bring all these, like when we did Project Basecamp, we said we're going to bring these 6 PLCs in and we're going to test them and we're going to release the results. What was the intention when you brought in all this medical gear and started testing it and found St. Jude's? Was it getting some skills for your people, industry knowledge? I mean, what was the goal?
You know, we're interested in connected devices, and we're interested in life-critical systems, and so we focused on cardiac systems to start.
Okay.
So that was, we narrowed our focus to that technology suite. And there's really only a handful of major players, major manufacturers in that cardiac implantable space. So that was where we started with our focus, and when we're going sideways from there to some of the larger systems and other types of connected devices.
You know, you talked about going down this road with St. Jude because you had just on background and past experiences from other people, you had an idea of how they would react. And I'm guessing they reacted pretty much like you expected. Is that correct, or did you?
Well, look, I mean, we thought there was a chance of some litigation. I've never been accused of lying before in my career. I didn't expect to be sued for defamation in this case. We thought maybe there'd be some regulatory focus, DMCA, for example. We're all familiar with the updates that came out with that in October. So, you know, it's been an exercise for us in terms of having our research validated. We've been through a couple of rounds of that now. In response to the lawsuit, we had a number of independent researchers come in and reproduce our research. They came in very skeptical, I will say. It's been one of the most difficult exercises in my career, having to sort of watch my peers in industry come in with doubt on their faces and stand by as they went through the same steps that we did to come to the same conclusions, which they did. And now, of course, we've got the FDA, the DHS, and St. Jude themselves acknowledging the existence of the vulnerabilities. But yeah, you know, in research, as we know, if you can sort of get remote root 1 out of 10 times, that's good enough to demonstrate the existence of a vulnerability. In this case, we had to get it 95% of the time reliable, and in order to reassure these skeptical folks that indeed these were real issues. So working to that level of scrutiny has been a learning experience.
How about the other players like the FDA and the press and the public and the other other clients that you have and things like that? Were there any reactions to what you did that surprised you? I'm sure you knew this was not going to be a stress-free experience, but did anything, were people more accepting?
I steeled myself for a lot of criticism from my peers in industry, because I knew I'm very familiar with the folks who have worked very hard and effectively, and I commend them for their work on vulnerability disclosure policy, for example. And I knew that I was going to draw some heat from that crowd, but I was pleasantly surprised, in fact, by the number of folks, my peers in industry, who supported us. Some of them did that publicly, a lot of them did that privately. So that was a nice surprise. The media, I've never had so much media experience in my life, and they were very skeptical as well, up until this week, if you will.
Really?
The alleged vulnerabilities. Well, I mean, if anybody bothered to read the response to the lawsuit, that they've been proven to exist by folks other than ourselves, who are very, very well respected in our industry. And I'm not sure what's alleged about that. But now, of course, we've got recognition that indeed these vulnerabilities do exist. What my biggest challenge is right now is that, okay, great, there's been an advisory from DHS, there's been an update from St. Jude Medical that does not fix all of the problems. It fixes some problems related to the at-home monitoring unit. But the common perception, I worry, out there is that this fixes everything. These implants have not been touched yet. They have not been updated yet. They have the same issues as they did months ago when we first reported these vulnerabilities. So that's my challenge now, is helping folks understand that.
And that might be a good, final question is, we don't have, I don't think there's a huge medical contingent here. It's more oil and gas, electric, water, things like that. But they have to deal with the legacy issue where they have systems that are supposed to last 10 or 20 years. And when you find a problem, it's like, well, what do I do with this? The medical, maybe the lifetime isn't quite as long, but sometimes the problems are harder because the implants are actually in patients spread all over the world as opposed to one plant. What do you see happening in the medical community as serious vulnerabilities are found in these devices that are widely deployed? What's the way forward?
There's a lot of activity going on in this space. We're seeing experts gather on this issue regularly. And if the FDA wasn't up to speed previously, it certainly is now on this issue. So yes, we've got some legacy problems here, but they're being recognized. And maybe the implants themselves still suffer these vulnerabilities, but the ecosystem around that communicates with that device, those are systems that we can easily update. We're starting to see that. And, hey, at the end of the day, we're going to have to rely on the manufacturers to issue updates and think about ongoing firmware updates and how they're deployed and how these systems are managed in an ongoing way, just as they do in your space. So,
yeah, do you see? I didn't think about this till you were talking, but do you see updates of firmware in implanted devices happening in the next 5 years? where I don't mean that the new ones, of course, will be better with the updated code, but when one is inside of me, is there going to be a signal that reboots and updates and reboots the device?
Well, I would be much more confident of that scenario playing out in a safe way if we were thinking about authentication of the person driving that process, which let's assume there's a very extensive testing process that happens up front so that this is verified, safe code, to the extent that we might see in the aviation industry. We need to double check, triple check, the whole SDLC thing. Let's assume that's all played out. Now who's actually deploying that update under what conditions, and how can we make sure that's a safe environment? Our research demonstrated issuing commands to implants that should only be generated by a physician. And we've demonstrated that that's not the case here with St. Jude, and in fact those commands could be generated by an adversary. So once we've addressed authentication, for example, as a fundamental issue kicking off the delivery of this therapy, and potentially we could conclude updates as well as a part of that. But we've got a little ways to go, I think, before that becomes a safe exercise.
Okay. Well, I really appreciate your time, and your team obviously did some good research. The disclosure part is, I'm sure everyone out there has their own opinion about that, but without a doubt, the end goal is good, to get these devices fixed, get the vendor to do their thing, and it sounds like some real good technical research was done by your team, and I just appreciate you coming here for this interview.
Thank you very much for having me. I appreciate that too, and we've all got a lot to learn from one another in this industry, and look, this might not have played out perfectly, but we feel at the end of the day we've achieved two things, and that is the manufacturer being held accountable for these issues and patients being aware of their risks.
Okay, great. Thank you very much, Justine.
Thank you so much. Thank you very much.